For several centuries, people have entertained and tested their minds with a variety of logic puzzles, jigsaws, word matching, playing cards, thought experiments, or even mathematical equations. Any activity that involves empirical understanding alone can be generalized as a puzzle. Games that directly challenge intelligence are a common practice in expanding our minds and the way we think about stuff. From children to the elderly, people have always been gamers at heart, striving to answer complicated questions. Complex conundrums such as Towers of Hanoi involve logic that can also be applied to any sorting task, or how bulls and crows can test deductive reasoning. These assessments of knowledge often offer an algorithmic outlook which can be universally applied to any thoughtful dilemma. Whether it be iterative or recursive, this complexity is what allows us to properly learn and grow. One of the more famous examples are nonograms, commonly known as Picross. The premise for these grid puzzles is to figure out which of the boxes should be filled or clear by using the numbers on the margins. It's simple but makes for a nifty puzzle and creates a cute pictogram. Where a nonogram improves, however, is when colours are introduced. This allows for multiple candidates to provide more considerations and deductions to work for. A square could be red, green, blue, or just a blank. Although it may not have the symmetrical complexity of Sudoku, there is potentially more candidates to filter through, depending on the size of the grid and the number of colours involved. And unlike Sudoku, there's still the additional possibility that some squares are null, though some of these aspects could be considered as a negative in comparison to Sudoku. To increase the difficulty of a Sudoku puzzle, there would need to be less initial candidates provided in a certain pattern, whereas the difficulty in a nonogram is increased by adding more stuff. It's not immediately obvious, but if you were to put these puzzles side by side, you'll realise most of the complexity in harder nonograms can be more tedious than thought-provoking. Naturally, it will take longer to survey a 30 by 30 grid over a 10 by 10. Even if it only takes a few milliseconds to review the number of candidates in a row or column, those seconds will quickly add up each time you glance at them. Considering it's your main guideline for solving the puzzle, it's conceivable to believe that a substantial amount of time is spent reading the sidebars, and that time spent reminding yourself of the possible candidates will increase as the grid itself grows larger in size and colours. On the other hand, in Sudoku, you have a set 9x9 grid with 9 numbers each, no more, no less. It's always consistent. This intricate symmetry also allows solving techniques to be more interchangeable, practical, and diverse. Comparing the two, there isn't much mathematical analysis you can do with nonograms due to their varying variables, and the techniques available will also take longer to apply because there's more inconsistent consideration. What I'm trying to get at is, unless you have a third party or a robot, the complexity of nonograms can be bogged down by their length, leaving the puzzles to feel more like endurance challenges. When solely judging the core concepts of these puzzles, it's clear that they can vary drastically in intricacy. This can be problematic because, as I mentioned earlier, the main idea behind these puzzles is that they're supposed to enrich our mindset, to think in a more deductive, algorithmic fashion, and the complexity of the puzzle can end up becoming the most important aspect when judging in this way. Unless you have a personal preference, you could arrive at a valid conclusion that some puzzles are just flat out more practical than others. Why spend more time to solve a nonogram when you can spend less time on a Sudoku puzzle that can provide more complicated symmetrical formations and test more solving strategies? But these days we live in a modern society. Puzzles are no longer bound by pen and paper, as they can be translated into electronic format. More specifically, video games have become the new frontier for puzzlers, from turn-based strategy games to fast-paced versus matches. There's loads of puzzle games out there, but rarely do they match the intricacy of their previous primitive counterpart. Video games are the most complex evolution of media, allowing us to engage with their visuals, audio, and interactivity that may be lacking in films or books. But despite the ceiling for complexity, a majority of these games rely on less logical mechanics such as randomization to provide the crux of the gameplay experience. Relying on randomness isn't inherently terrible, but it can often be problematic if your luck becomes a more prominent factor than skill or strategy. For physical examples, card games like Klondike or Solitaire are notorious for setting up impossible to win scenarios. But then there's board game variants such as Chess 960 that can add a unique spin to opening gambits, and make you rethink your original strategies. Random properties need to be considered carefully depending on the type of game. Getting back to video games, they tend to incorporate a hybrid approach between dexterity, wisdom, and chance. Just look at any platformer to see how varied these aspects can get. Some other genres are more focused on the strategic side. Role-playing games tend to sprinkle in some randomness to remove some of the repetitiveness, which can complement the large number of variables found in these dungeon crawlers. though it can be obnoxious at times with characteristics such as encounter rates and critical hit ratio. Instead, it's usually the fighter genre that's praised for its complexity, providing a gameplay loop of technical skill layered over counter strategies with dozens of combos to learn how to use and when to use. However, when it comes to video games using purely strategy as a means of engagement, it's frequently rare to come across. Typically, mindful interactivity is paired with either adroit or luck-based mechanics. Even the strategy game genre itself would usually have games that include hit percentages. You know when you play chess and you capture a unit? Imagine if there was a 50% chance that the act would just not work. That's one of the issues with having such a complex medium to work with. It can be very enticing for game designers to rely on additional bells and whistles to attempt at elevating the intricacy, but can instead bring down the level of strategy. It's why some people still prefer to stick to those pen and paper puzzles from the Jurassic period. There's no distractions, it's just you, the game, and your brain to solve the conundrum. Video games are the most complex evolution of media, but when it comes to untainted, tactical challenge, the media is woefully lacking in this category, and most of the games that do provide this type of gameplay are just a more convenient electronic version of those old newspaper distractions. One of the best examples from the strategy genre is Into the Breach. It's a grid-based tactics game with no hidden information. Enemy attacks are telegraphed in advance, and the user interface showcases the order of operations. But even this game has randomized weapon loot. These games aren't bad by any means. In fact, I think they're great and they offer their own individual kind of challenge, but they do lack the pure strategy found in something like a nonogram. And that's a shame, isn't it? Here we potentially have an entire medium to advance the way we interact with games, and very little of that evolution is spent on the reason we engage with these puzzles in the first place. So here's the question I'm trying to answer today. Is there a game that effectively bridges the gap between logic puzzles and video game design? I can think of one example. Hatena Satena is a nonogram puzzler for the Game Boy Advance released in 2001. Unfortunately, it was never localized outside of Japan despite being published by Hudson Soft, which had already proven successful with other ventures. Aside from a couple of blog posts and scattered fan sites, there isn't much popularity around the game, which is strange since one of the first things you'll notice is the bubbly art style. The graphic design was outsourced to Super Lovers, which was an early 2000s punk fashion brand known for embroidering super deformed pandas onto their overpriced clothing. Surprisingly, they're still going strong today. This type of chibi character design was very prevalent at the time with icons such as Puka or Super Milk-chan. The point I'm trying to make is, it's weird that the game didn't catch on despite following the popular trends at the time, and released on a system that was still new. Nowadays the art style serves as a unique set piece in contrast to other handheld games. Even the text on the logo is heavily stylized katakana. So on the surface, the abstract, colourful interface acts as a lovely coat of paint for what is actually an unexpectedly complex puzzler. The base of the game follows the colours nonogram setup. Use the margin numbers to determine the hue of each block. However, the notable difference is that there's no hierarchy of which colours are placed where. Normally the order of numbers would indicate which set of blocks would occur within a row or column, but here it uses a system similar to Minesweeper. This is the first important aspect about the game, the way it recontextualizes gameplay mechanics into the form of traditional puzzles. I've spoken previously about how randomization is double-edged in the ways it can be implemented, and examples where luck becomes the deciding factor of a puzzle, like Solitaire or Minesweeper in this case, can be detrimental to the intricacy of the puzzle. There's nothing mindful about losing a round over a percentage chance you have no control over, but one aspect that's lifted is the spread system. Once you fill a block, it can give a number from 0 to 3. This clue is then used for indicating how many candidates are adjacent to the currently selected block. This works very well in tandem with the existing margin candidate view, allowing puzzles to have a hidden volume layer. A column could have multiple small strips intersecting throughout, or one portion could be filled at the top. It also achieves something that couldn't be done with pen and paper alone, without relying on randomization, and trying to replicate this setup with a third party similar to Battleship would be extremely tedious. Imagine having someone point out the number of candidates every time you fill a square. This type of puzzle just inherently works better in video game format. In regular nonograms, you need to figure out how to fit the formation in a row, but here you need to consider almost each unit individually. Well, almost. If you check a block with no dead ends, or 4 candidates, then the block will automatically fill all the squares next to it, which makes sense, since if it showed 4 candidates are the next block, then you'd fill all adjacent blocks. This is the other benefit of placing the Minesweeper spread method into a coloured nonogram. It allows puzzles to be solved faster without compromising complexity. Remember the example I mentioned earlier about how it can take up time to repeatedly read through margins? Here's how much faster it is to spruce up the board. Most puzzles tend to be difficult to crack at first due to several interlocking candidates, causing more possibilities until you figure out the missing piece, and then everything else falls into place. And this is especially the case for grid-based puzzles such as Sudoku or Picross, but in Picross's case, it can still take a while to reach that phase, where you have the information to chip away at finding the finishing chain. Hatena Satena removes the padding, allowing you to jump right into the more difficult quandaries, while you can still keep your eyes peeled on the grid. Sometimes big chunks of the pictogram can have the same pigment, so you can have these large waves of colour wash over the grid, so large that they even cause slowdown for the system. Not even the Game Boy Advance's processor could be prepared for this. You'll notice a quick cutscene plays when achieving the spread, and it serves an additional system, a life counter, though there are 2 life counters specifically. If you're able to trigger a character cutscene in the story campaign, then you're rewarded with an extra heart for the respective alien. The hearts are then used to unlock some of the more difficult puzzles, making them an incentive for hardcore gamers to effectively calculate which squares would potentially offer a screen clear, properly analysing the side margins and the surrounding digits on the board. But if you happen to incorrectly input the wrong colour, then you not only lose a heart, but also deplete the current life counter. Normally when you make an error on a pen and paper puzzle, there's usually no way to tell until you arrive at a contradiction that you then figure out towards the end of the conundrum. When translating these games to computers and consoles, developers often take the electronic liberty to include a life system so the player doesn't waste their time on a doomed puzzle whilst contributing to more convenience, though the punishment for failing would usually equate to receiving a game over anyway, requiring you to restart the puzzle, arguably providing more of a lenient safety net rather than an incentive to properly analyse the numbers. By doubling up the standard life system with an additional heart currency to unlock bonus content, Hatena Satena entices efficiency for those willing to correctly engage themselves with the challenge it presents. Losing a life may not be a big deal in the puzzle alone, but potentially losing a heart can be demoralising for those aiming at 100% completion, naturally adding a new layer of difficulty. There are a couple of games that offer a digital spin on older puzzles. Steven Sausage Roll's take on Sokobon, Cooler World's take on logic mazes, or even attempts on the GBA itself. All these include some kind of electronic spin on their classic puzzle counterparts, whether it be a cleaner presentation or a life counter. But Hatena Satena goes further beyond even those examples, by including its very own scoring system. The game doesn't just measure ways you fail, but also the ways you succeed, particularly by assessing the proficiency. The number of points rewarded for filling in a square can be multiplied when colouring in a chain. This can be done with rapid repetitive success, or triggering a cutscene. The score number then multiplies across each effective unit, ballooning with groups more than individual calculations. Essentially, this encourages a playstyle that requires advanced foresight into not only how blocks are coloured, but also in which order. This directional tactic is a very seamless method to link time management with accuracy and analysis. Scoring systems are fairly common in video games, even as early as Pong, though this calculation of the player's effectiveness is more often found in skill-based challenges, which isn't too different from real sports, like with basketball's points increasing depending on the distance, or golf's pass system focusing on precision. So to have this type of scoring be implemented into an exclusively strategic context and still have it function in a way that complements all of the previous game's mechanics is something else. Completing the level whilst regarding the most efficient maneuvers in the minimum amount of time is already an arguable evolution in the way we interact with puzzles. But to then take already well-established nonograms and translate them flawlessly into the video game's medium with meaningful additions like the unsorted margins, spread candidates, heart collectibles, and the scoring, all culminating together to further incentivize solely logical thinking to its potentially maximum output. There's only one way to describe that. Doggedly Bonza. The extra cherry is that the game comes with its own level editor, and can share custom challenges with other puzzle enthusiasts. There's already a ton of content, including 4 story campaigns, a full-on tutorial, and extra unlockables. The developers clearly understood they were making a truly advanced puzzler, so they wanted to give the player the tools to experiment further with the system they had already crafted. The options don't disappoint either. You can change the hues of the palette, the size of the grid, numerous save slots, the time limit, and even provides copy and paste tools, which is especially impressive for an early 2001 GBA game. But what's somehow even more fascinating is the option to increase the candidate spread from 4 to 8, allowing the game to borrow even more from Minesweeper. It makes the game immediately more difficult, and is mostly locked behind the level editor for people who like pain. I've already discussed the visuals, but the soundtrack is real great too, and I've had it playing throughout the whole video. Another thing to mention about the unlockables is that they have references to past Hudson Software projects, which is another fun addition. Overall, the game has dozens of hours worth of complex logical nonograms, along with the wonderful presentation and even its own puzzle creator. If you're a fan of puzzle games, then it's definitely worth playing, as it's debatably the best in the genre. But you know, why does any of this matter? Why do critics and enthusiasts care so much about the complexity of gameplay and the way we interact with the medium? And I think it ties back to what I said at the beginning. Games that directly challenge intelligence are a common practice in expanding our minds and the way we think about stuff. Problem solving is a very broad application of the activities we participate in, and puzzles have always been straightforward in testing that aspect about ourselves. So to play a game that really pushes this logic to such an extreme is a triumph for puzzlers as a whole. Basically, having a brain is good, and you should train it regularly and efficiently. Goodbye.